way too. I was that way too.
Welcome back, young man. Welcome. It's been a while since we've talked. What have you been up to?
Well, last time we chatted feels like a many months ago.
It
At
was
least a
probably
year
half
ago.
a year. Yeah. Well,
Something like
a
that.
year that long? Wow.
I think it was somewhere in that range. So
I think I still
we
had dark hair when we talked last.
yeah, right. Um, we've been very busy. So my company, the Merry Beggars, which is the entertainment division of Relevant Radio, we were, I think, still just in the development phase of the series that we're releasing now, which is called very simply The Saints. And people can find it at thesaintspodcast.com. That was the thing that we were developing. And what it is basically taking the lives of the saints, Joan of Arc, Francis of Assisi, Benedict, St. Thomas Aquinas, all of them, and bringing professional Hollywood writers in, developing their lives into a 5-episode adventure.
Per
Each
saint.
episode, per saint. Each episode is like 15 minutes long, and then releasing them as a weekday radio drama, a weekday radio adventure. And it's been crazy. There are over 300 people involved in the production, hundreds of actors, Oscar-nominated writers and directors. He's just writing for us, but we have lots of directors. We have Lazarus, Demetrius Troy, who plays Lazarus on The Chosen, is a director and actor for us. Our casting director, Kevin Collins, starred opposite Tina Fey and Steve Martin. So like the team is unbelievable.
How did you go about finding all these people, Pete?
I'm in different ways. Some of them are just old friends that I've gotten to know. Most of them, I mean, they're all Catholic. Well, Demetrius Troy is Orthodox, but most of them are Catholic. And if you're trying to be a faithful Catholic and you're involved in entertainment, you're going to meet the other 12 people who are trying to do that as well. And so
there are 300 of them, right?
Well, so we make distinctions. Staff members need to be like full-time employees. You need to be Catholic. You need to be on board. You need to be, on mission, so on and so forth. Writers, same thing. Like you don't necessarily need to be Catholic, but like you need to at least not dislike the Catholic Church, and you need to be probably Christian and so on and so forth. Directors, same thing. Actors, who makes our lunch, I don't really care that much about. Like, I hope they're a good person. I would love for them to be Catholic, but that's not a need. And same with the actors. Like, we want to work with the most professional, the best actors that we can find. Praise God, we're outside of Chicago, which is awesome because there's tons of actors in the Chicago area, and that's been fantastic to work with. But most of the people we work with are not Catholic. They're not necessarily Christian. We put the scripts up online. We invite people to auditions. We get hundreds of auditions. And then we have a guy, Kevin Collins, whose full-time job is with an assistant to sort through all of those auditions and figure out the people who are going to bring these stories to life. So it's a really interesting team. And there's a lot of incredible people that we've met. And it's cool to see people get attracted to this project.
Now, this project was your brainchild, correct?
Yeah, it was. It was. We were originally going to launch it in early 2023. It was originally going to be called Lent with the Saints. And we were going to produce a bunch of saint stories to release during Lent. And then we nearly died. We were pulling all hours. It was a way bigger project than we realized when we launched it. And most of that has to do with I generally am just unwilling to compromise on quality. Like, what we're producing is expensive. It's takes a lot of money, a lot of time. And that's why people are falling in love with it. That's why it's succeeding. But when we launched it, we had no idea the level and the complexity that we were getting into. The initial idea came from essentially our audience is Christian, it's Catholic. And these stories, no one's telling them in a way that is exciting and beautiful and human. a lot of the way that saint stories are told is like they're animatronic holy cards, where they're very caricatured, sort of stereotypical superheroes, where they're basically all supermen, superwomen who were perfect from birth until they died. I mean, that's hyperbole, but a lot of saint stories don't let you into the fact that Joan of Arc had to disobey her parents to follow the voices in her head in order to lead the French army and save France from the English. Or that Benedict left his family and probably broke his parents' heart in order to find God in solitude. Or that, Juan Diego got a vision of Our Lady, heard that his uncle had been wounded, and then tried to take a different path in order to basically avoid Our Lady and the vision in order to hide from Our Lady so he could, help his uncle when he was sick. So there's such a human dimension to all of these stories that when you encounter them are just really, really moving, and they hadn't been told that way. So we did it.
Drew you to? I mean, I think you answered this in an indirect way, but what drew you to this project? What did the saints give we mere mortals made of clay and sinning daily? What do they offer us?
Well, have you listened to the series, Norm?
Some, not
and
all.
What did you think of it?
I'm biased. I'm looking for tangible signs of grace everywhere in the world. I'm waiting for you to do St. Jude, who is the criminal defense lawyer's saint. Causes. But no, I mean, I'm still a stranger to the Catholic Church in some ways, although I was brought up with a passing acquaintanceship with it and would call myself a Catholic if I had to call myself anything. I'm not an active member of the church, and I'm not a member of a sacramental community. I'm still very much a Protestant at heart, I suppose, longing and looking for the voice of God. And so what I see in the saints are people who've risked all for something.
Why do you like being a criminal defense lawyer? What about that profession drew you or keeps you there? What romantic ideal drew you in?
I'm not sure it was a romantic ideal. I've been
What
preoccupied.
was the size of the check that drew?
A lot less than you might think. Those of you who'd like to retire me, we can have the Retire Norm Fund. When it hits a certain point, you have to hear from me again. No, I think that, for me, that's a really hard question to answer, Pete. I mean, I grew up in search of God. I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, and so my heart was broken early on in my life when my father disappeared from our family and not to be seen again for 40 years. My mother basically disappeared as she dealt with her woe, and I was shopped around with relatives who put me on couches that they didn't really want to put me on. And so, periodically I'd get dragged into a church, and I was a literalist. These guys would stand in front of the audience and talk about God. And I'm like, if they can know him, I want to know him too.
So there's a couple of things you said that I want to pick up on by way of answering, why are we telling these stories? What do the saints have for us? So it sounds like, I mean, I would presume when you're working in law and as a criminal defense lawyer, there's some notion of justice that keeps you going, right? Some notion of serving justice, whether or not you say no.
No, yesterday is a perfect example. I resolved two cases. One was a murder and one was a rape. And the rape case was a 7-year-old case. It kicked around a few lawyers' office, ended up here, and we ended up with the guy pleading guilty to serving alcohol to a minor and reckless endangerment, and he didn't go to prison. The murder case, more complicated gang shooting kind of thing. The guy pled to manslaughter in 20 years. Within the marketplace of human suffering that I inhabit, those were both very good outcomes.
Yeah.
And so in the end, when you work with a client and try to counsel them about what to do, you have to take a risk and show them yourself and show them. And so I try to speak to my clients, because I'm old, as I would speak to my children. And I say to them, if you were my child, I would have you do this. And I'm aware that in my case, what I'm doing is being the father I wish I had at a juncture that's awful for the client, where they have to make life defining decisions and there's no win. I'm making the best human choice I can.
So
And I don't call that
you're
justice.
giving to them the father figure that um sorry, Freud is calling. You're giving
I
to
know.
them, you're giving to them the father figure that you wish you had had. You know, in some way. I'm not trying to like psychoanalyze this,
Yeah, no,
but
I
like,
mean, no, look, hey, I've been in psychoanalysis for
yeah,
15,
this is the
16 years.
budget.
I don't even know how long anymore. And, this has not gone unnoticed between me and the guy who has
Well,
this
the reason that I
4
pick
hours
up
a
on
week.
that is because I think that is a notion of justice, that there is a bond there, a human relationship of father and son, and a bond of love that you are trying to give to them because it's what you wish you had, right? That
I
there
view
is,
it more as grace. I view it more as unrequited love. And so because justice, is it just to put somebody in a box for 20 years because somebody got shot and killed? That just seems obscene to me. It seems crazy to me.
yeah.
It's meat cleaver stuff. It's not the precision that justice requires. And so I view the state as a mystery, as something that needs to be explained, and as a deeply suspicious factor in our lives. I buy Augustine's notion of the city of God and the city of man. The city of God, man, is what we have because we live in a fallen, broken world. We aspire to something better.
Yeah, I guess the reason I pick up on the notion of justice and on the bonds that we all are like yearn for in our relationships, both friendships and family, is because I think that everyone's heart, there are there are natural longings for the goods and the things that we as human beings need to thrive, right? So, you know, you talked about your heart being broken at a young age by your dad leaving. And that, if you read into that, that would mean that there is a sense of needing or deserving or longing
Wanting,
for a parental
longing, yeah.
figure in order to be fulfilled and be happy. And the reality is that life is a veil of tears, that no one's life is exempt from suffering, and that even if you have everything you want, every paycheck, every relationship, every whatever, there's never going to be a stasis this side of heaven where you'll be euphorically happy in an ongoing state, right? You might get that for like a second and then it drops off. And the reason that I have been so moved in producing the saint stories and in telling the stories of their lives is they had, if you read and study their lives, they had the same risks, temptations, contexts that we have. Great story is Joan of Arc. Her brother, after Joan of Arc gets captured by the English, burned at the stake, her brother Pierre finds a young woman, young French woman, starts passing her off as Joan of Arc resurrected and selling tickets to come see Joan of Arc resurrected. So it's not as if, you know, back in medieval era that people were holier, if not the opposite, because there were not such a thing as the internet and cell phones and to document and record everyone's iniquities. The reason that I love the saint stories is because they're real stories. Every single story we tell is historically researched. We have a research director on our team that helps us actually,
Where do you find the material?
uh, let me finish this and then I'll get into that.
Okay, yeah.
So we try and ground all of these stories in historical facts because I think it's really important for people to see. It's really important for me to see and encounter these stories and recognize that that is what my life is capable of. That if I cooperate with the grace of God, my life is not just about having 2.5 kids, getting a white picket fence, you know, maximizing my 401k, retiring, moving to Florida, getting so bored with my life, and then dying of boredom. My life is capable of participating in a divine drama that is the history of our world. It's unbelievably easy to get cynical about anything in life: marriage, religion, institutions, institutionalized religion. And the beauty of the saint stories is that their stories deal with all of those things. Catherine of Siena wrote to the Pope and basically read him the riot act for corrupting the church, right? The world that they inhabited is just as real as ours. And when I read the stories and I open my heart to them. And it's beautiful, the power of story. Story gets past all of our defenses. Like it is the way into the heart. If you
Four of the most powerful words in the English language are "once upon a time."
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
belief all of a sudden, and you're transported to a world where anything is possible.
Absolutely. And the beauty, to put a bow on it, the beauty of the saint stories is that they show us the size and breadth that the human soul is meant for. Anytime that we settle for than less than we were made for, our souls suffocate. That's why people can be materialists as long as they're inside of a Christian culture. But as soon as materialism becomes the dominant culture, which is happening in the US, people naturally start going into like crazier forms of spiritual belief, like crystals and all that stuff, and astrology and whatnot. And our like as soon as our soul is not in the habitat that it's meant for, which is relationship with God, we become suffocated. And the beauty of the saint stories is that they show us what our lives are capable of if we have the courage and the humility to respond to God's invitation, which is grace.
So, yes, but tell me about the sin of pride in reading this story of the saints. One of the things that persuaded me that the Catholic Catechism was pure genius. About 5-6 years ago, I read through it. Well, there you go. I've got a copy in my briefcase because I always take it with me wherever I go. But it talked about the sin of pride and how, I remember reading, and I'll give you a personal, and this was the example from the Catechism, the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, and he breaks his hip, and he had a tangible sign of his encounter with the divine. And as a kid, I thought, where is God? I would take a broken hip to feel the grip,
Yeah.
No, and the Catechism warns that that's almost pride. And is there a danger, Pete, in valorizing the saints such that you're holding up to us impossible models that we might be tempted to try to replicate, making ourselves divine in our own images rather than receiving the image of God? Because to me, that the mystery of grace somehow is being open to this invisible world, to being summoned by the ever-present but always slightly out of view God, I think. And I still struggle with this fundamentally, which is why I was so looking forward to talking to you. But do you worry that in holding up the saints as examples, you might be inviting people to experiment with a form of pride?
Totally. When you say you struggle with this, what is the this you're referring to?
I can't remember how many sentences
ago. No. Okay. No, then whatever. Yes and no. So one is, this is entertainment. So there always is going to be some level to which we're, if we had a choice between Saint A and Saint B, and Saint B was a holy monk who no one heard of and died, and he's going to be like on level 10 in heaven, and we're all going to be on like level 3, if we're lucky. Versus that saint story versus like Joan of Arc, we're telling Joan of Arc. Why? Because she's super exciting on just like a human level, right? So there's definitely, if someone's entire religious experience was the Saints podcast, available at thesaintspodcast.com. If someone's entire religious experience was
created by Pete Atkinson, yeah.
Well, that would be terrible, right? Because this is in some sense an entertainment product. We're aware of that. That being said, and the subtitle of the series is Adventures of Faith and Courage. So there's also an emphasis on adventure. That being said, there are saints like Joan of Arc, who was really insecure in herself. When she started hearing the saints' voices, she had no idea what they were, right? So she hears the voices of Saint Michael and 2 other saints, and she doesn't know what she's hearing at first. And when they start asking her and commanding her to do certain things, she is not totally confident in it. She's questioning things. The real story of every saint is that God is ultimately the protagonist in their story. That it's not a story of extremely virtuous or powerful human beings. It's a story of a human being who surrenders to God's action in their life, which means that there can be a temptation to want to control.
But how do you know? How do you know? I mean, so for example, we were joking around about Freud before. Let's take a trip into modern psychiatric world, and Joan having problems with vocation in life. Her parents send her to a doctor, and she says, "I'm hearing these voices. What's he going to say?" And and this is where my spiritual journey began as a kid, when I would go to a church and hear people say, "The Lord told me this," or "God said," or "The Bible is inspired. This is the voice of God." I want to hear that voice. How do you know? How do you, and I don't think I've ever heard, and I've never had an auditory sense that there is a being in the world who I could assign the name God to and could say with confidence that this being spoke to me. If anything, there's a whisper that fits from time to time, and I'm asked to act in faith on that whisper and against the hope that I haven't kidded myself. That's the dialectic of faith in my life, which is another obvious reason why I'm not going to be a saint. But when I hear you talk about Joan, she couldn't tell. Michael was talking to her and whatnot. I'm like, that's a little rich.
Do you know a couple things? Do you know who Charles de Foucauld was? Have you ever heard that name?
No, I don't think so. No.
He was a rich womanizer, alcoholic.
Sounds like a great guy.
He probably had quite the
Probably
time.
needed a lawyer. Yeah.
He ends up converting, going into the desert and translating the Bible into the local dialect that had never been translated. It was in Arabia. I don't know where. And he eventually gets martyred by by like an Islamic group that was in there. I think I could have that story wrong.
The Allahu Akbar Club,
I haven't done research into that story yet, but you hear that story and it's like, well, that's not the story of a saint. He didn't do anything after. There's no great work that he left us. It's not like you have the Missionaries of Charity from Mother Teresa or whatnot, but he is a saint. I think he's blessed right now. And the reason is because being a saint or not being a saint is not judged on the quality of the human works that you leave behind. It's judged on your relationship to God, and that's it, right? That's it. It's really, it's really easy to think that there's a distinction between being a saint and being virtuous, right? And works and grace. So you're a saint even if you're, I think I forget which saint it is, but there's a saint of addicts who was an addict up until his deathbed, like an opium addict. He never did anything great on human terms, but he is a saint. And Pope Francis had a great homily recently. I think it was his Christmas homily, in which he warns against people idolizing a god of achievement, is what he termed it. And it's so good. Because
Kiwanis Club God, right?
Yeah. It's sort of like, I'm a free market guy, but it's easy when you're in a capitalist society to think that achievement and monetary levels you equate with goodness, because that's how you start ranking yourself, because that's how you feel secure and whatnot. And the freedom of the Christian religion and of being a Catholic is that being a saint is disattached from any achievement whatsoever. It's the most free, like that is the good news, so like the Christian faith, when they call it the good news is that like you are loved and beloved independent from anything you do with your life. And that receiving that gift is what destroys our pride, because that love is something you can't earn, you can't increase, you can't decrease.
That's grace itself, right there, is the ability, right? And I think the element of choice is the ability to receive it. I mean, that it wouldn't sin be rejecting the obvious signs of grace?
Yeah. So sin is the rejection of grace. It's the rejection of God's grace. The Greek term is hamartia, which means missing the mark. That's more virtue. But yeah, it's essentially rejection of grace. In terms of hearing God audibly and whatnot, like I totally, it was on the same page. I remember literally writing a letter. I read this small book of like Padre Pio's miracles and him talking to guardian angels and whatnot. And I was like, well, that's cool. I want that. I wrote a letter to Padre Pio and was like, so and so forth. I said a prayer, I put it in a desk, and I was like, Padre Pio, make that letter disappear and I'll believe in you. wake up the next morning, letter did not disappear, but somehow I stumbled on and struggled on. So yeah, like there's a very literal sense of faith, which is innocent and beautiful and simple and not real, right? It doesn't capture the fullness of the faith. It's beautiful, it's very innocent, but God is not a being among other beings. That's sort of primitive religion, paganism, is that God is a being among other beings. And so we can interact with him like
And for those of you without a philosophic cast of mind, we're not talking about beans as in white or lima. We're talking about beings. You know,
This is the existence itself. And part of the radical nature of Christianity is that in a world of polytheism and paganism, the Judeo-Christian tradition revealed that God is being itself. He's not a being among other beings. He is being from which all existence flows. So I think that when one is discerning, like, can I hear an audible voice of God? It's like, God could do that, sure. But God reveals himself through, primarily in my experience, through the movements of my own heart and through revealed scripture and through the lives of the saints and through the art of the church. And I think it's not correct to think that it's sort of like the atheist who says, give me material evidence for the existence of God. And it's like, where did this material evidence that you're looking for come from? Like, you can't see the box when you're inside the box. You can't see outside of existence and then behold like a blob of existing stuff that you call God. And then, as an existing being, see that. Like, if God is being itself, if he is uncreated existence, then the way that we perceive and interact with that existing, see, even the language, I was going to say existing thing, but we can't say that about God.
No, I get that.
The way that we interact and experience God is going to be different from every other thing that we experience in our lives, because he's not a physical being, which is why.
How do you know how do you know that is an experience of God and not just, as Dostoevsky might have put it, some ill-digested liver? You'll recall notes from the Underground. But how do you know that? Or is that the wrong question?
No, I mean, how do you know your wife loves you?
Most days I don't. I accept, I mean, she's a wonderful woman, but
welcome to marriage therapy.
Hey, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. If ever there was a candidate for sainthood, Pete, it's she. I accept her presence in my life, and I'm grateful for the gift of her devotion. And I do my best to return it, even as I fail in 1,001 quotidian or ordinary ways. But she's an easy case because she's physically present.
Right, but the relationship isn't. And that's what I'm saying is, like, if you're looking for, take as just like a premise that we're trying to prove, the idea, the Christian proposal for God, which is that God is a person, three persons, but in this instance we'll say person, and the way that we react to him or interact with him is going to be as to another person. Well, by way of analogy, how do you know the quality or the existence of a relationship with another person? The way that we discern that and think about that is going to be different than the way we think about material existence, right? Because the relationship is immaterial. You can't sit down and say, I'm 100% certain that my wife loves me in the way that I'm 100% certain I'm holding a book. But you can have a moral certainty about it, right? So you're certain you're certain your mother loved you, or you're certain that so-and-so loved you. And usually that's through signs or gifts or graces, in the instance of God, but it would be signs of that relationship. So like, I know my wife loves me because she tells me, but also because of the meals are delicious and none of them have contained poison up until this point. So that would be that would be the way I would approach it, is the moral certainty that you have that God exists is through the gifts and the graces that you receive throughout your life. But then also, belief in God is itself a grace. Like the ability to have faith is theological grace.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gift.
Well, I would agree with that. And then I think in the ability to accept it or to be open to it is a gift as well. Um, I would think, or at least I believe. But I couldn't point to a place in my psyche or in my imagination and say with any degree of confidence, "There's God." Um, it's rather a sense of being enveloped, and saying to myself, I don't know this, but I take it on faith that this is that. But I do. It's not that I hear from it. I don't talk to it expecting an answer. I more or less experience the phenomena, and that is contentless and could be just an illusion.
So you know what the most practical thing that consistently bolsters my faith on a day-to-day basis is that the Catholic Church's articulation of what the human person is
Fair enough.
is the clearest and most stable version of that anthropology that I've ever experienced in my life. And when my life is not going well, when my heart is not going well, when I'm, filled with anxiety or depression, or I have, problems in relationships or problems in my own life or whatever, when I come back to what the Catholic Church proposes about the human person, instant clarity and an instant map towards health and thriving. And, it's also impossible
That was
without
my
grace.
experience. No, that was my experience of reading through the Catechism. It was that was the most satisfying account of the human condition. It made me appreciate in ways that somebody who flirted with Protestantism for a long period in his life could not. The magisterium of the Church,
Which
as
is
opposed to yeah.
And what's interesting is even that is not faith. So you can see the Catechism, you can see the clarity and intelligence and just like, rock solid picture of what a human person is in the Catechism, in the Catholic tradition. And still that's not, there's a gap between that and faith. And what that is the relationship with Jesus, the relationship with God. And that the drama of human existence is not a formula, and it cannot be worked outside of that individual person's soul. Like there is nothing that I can say on this podcast, whatever, that will, except by the Holy Spirit, that will compel another person to instantly have an encounter and believe in God, because that needs to be worked out throughout the history of a person's life. It's not, it's not a switch or a formula or a button. It's a real history that God is working through.
And hence the saints. What gives the Catholic Church confidence to recognize that the saints are in fact having a relationship with God? In other words, what are the criteria by which the Church makes a decision that this guy with a remarkable life is a saint and this one isn't?
So we have a process for that.
No, and and you mentioned it before because somebody's blessed. He's not necessarily.
Oh yeah. So I really should know this, but I should know this, completely down pat. But I'll give it my best shot. I believe.
Well, you're not going to be on the committee this month, then.
Yeah, right. I think there are about 3 stages. I think it's servant of God, venerable, blessed, and becoming a saint. And historically, there are only about 10,000 saints that are canonized by the Church over 2,000 years. Right, that's not very high, and it's not. This is not a definitive list of saints. These are just saints recognized by the Church. So most of the saints probably are mothers and fathers who laid down their lives for their children. and will never be known to any of us. But these saints that the church has canonized go through this process called canonization. And the first step is you do an exhaustive inventory of this person's life, and there needs to be evidence of heroic virtue. So it's not enough that someone, was generally not a jerk, or,
You're
didn't
out of
kill
luck,
anyone.
Mike.
Yeah, right. It needs to be that their life demonstrates some level of heroic virtue above the call of ordinary service. And then you need 2 miracles. And this is one of the things that the Catholic Church has gotten really, really good at, which is there are lots of accounts of miracles. And if you would like to meet someone extremely skeptical, talk to someone investigating saints, because they'll get tons of, Saint Padre Pio healed me of a canker sore, or, Saint Jude got me a much better wife this time, right? Those are being facetious, but and possibly blasphemous, but they get all these accounts of
Prepare
saints.
the furnace,
Yeah, thanks, Norm.
Mr. Atkinson.
They get all these accounts of miracles, and then there's someone called Diabolus Advocatus, which is a devil's advocate, who basically, it's a very legal system. They go and argue that none of these are miracles. And there's 2 advocates, I believe. There's the advocate for the saint for
That sounds
beatification,
like a great job,
and then there's the devil's advocate. I just found your next career, Norm.
Yeah.
And they go through this whole process, and when they can verify that something is actually miraculous, that doctors have no medical explanation for it, that psychologists have no explanation for it, so on and so forth, then this will be ratified by the Vatican as being a genuine miracle. And then if they get the first miracle, then that's venerable, and if they get the second, then that is blessed. Something like that. I think I have it mixed up, but anyway, after 2 miracles have been verified, then they are up for canonization by the Catholic Church.
How many Americans have been named saints?
Oof. I don't know the
Father
number.
McGivney, is he canonized? Father McGivney from New Haven?
He is not. He is, I believe, a blessed.
Okay.
Founder of the Knights of Columbus, but he is not.
I go to the church that he used to preach in. It's several blocks from here, and it's a quite moving experience. He died a young man. I think he was 46 at the time of his death.
We're actually looking at telling his story on the Facebook.
Well, I hope you do. I mean, it's an interesting story. Come on out to the church. It's 2 blocks from here, and you can hear there. I'll introduce you to a man named John Morella. John Morella is, I think, chief legal counsel for the Knights of Columbus. He's a
wow
prosecutor, and he and I had a lot of cases together. And he would always tell me he was praying for me, and I'd tell him, well, I sure as hell need it, because I'm only half a Christian. I believe in sin. It's grace that I struggle with, and when
And I think, just to get back to the larger theme of grace and sin and belief in God, I think so. Obviously, where I got my faith from is from my parents, right? My parents raised me as in the Catholic faith. I was sort of not really fully bought in. I would say probably until college, and then definitely in grad school. And usually my cycle of life has been to fall into sin, to make terrible choices, bad choices, whatever, and then coming back to the faith and having just a deep encounter of the fact that in the midst of today's modern world, there are men who have chosen as their vocation to be a priest, and their entire life is dedicated to holding the door of God's love open for others. And when I think back to my life, one of the most amazing graces of my life is people like Father Scott Woods and dozens of other priests that I knew growing up, who spent their day in, day out just trying to form people in God's love and help their relationship with God. And I think about probably 6, maybe 10 of my childhood friends are priests now. So I know that I had a sort of rare friend group growing up, but it was extremely beautiful. And those are, to this day, those are some of the best men I've ever known in my life. And that's a grace, right? Like, not everyone gets that.
No, that's true. You mentioned earlier something about how a Christian subculture can support various life forms, various ways of living, but in the absence of that subculture or background set of assumptions, those lives fall apart. Say more about that, because Mike and I talk a lot about what I call the bottom falling out of pluralism and our spending down a moral capital that it took millennia to build, and now we've got pots saying to the potter, why makest me thus? And everybody's trying to become a god in their own image, and the result is they all love themselves, which is the wrong thing to love, and pluralism is disintegrating into utter chaos. When you make that remark, that those are the associations I draw. I'd be curious about yours.
Well, I'm just thinking about like what's the most obvious, compelling way to articulate it. Mike, you have children, right?
I have one.
You have one child, and Norm, you have children, and I have one and another on the way,
and
I
6
think,
grandchildren. Top that.
well, I'm working on it. And I think we know as parents, like having a child is the most meaningful, beautiful, crazy experience, but it's also the hardest. Like it's unbelievably hard. And it's harder on my wife than it is on me. It's Francesca, my daughter, is like just unbelievably beautiful and good and just incredible. But especially that first year, she didn't sleep through the night for 18 months.
That's hard to do in 1 year. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And if I did not have my religious faith, and if I did not have a view of the human person as being infinitely important, eternally significant, to the point where raising children is going to eclipse anything I could possibly do with my entire life.
That's right.
That worldview compels me that I want to be open to as many children as God gives me and my wife, because I know that when I'm 60, 70, whatever, that when I look back and I see, 5 people, whatever, that exist and God willing are semi-sane, despite my parenting, that will be the meaning of my life. Now that's a religious idea, because after experiencing a year of sleeplessness, the very short-term selfish decision would be, I'm not doing that again. My wife is not doing that again. I now love and revere the power of sleep. Yeah. But that's not the way that my wife and I, God willing, are planning to live our lives. And that's because of a Christian worldview. Now, is this just Peter Atkinson's experience, in 2023, 2024? No, because if you look at the birth rate of our increasingly affluent society, it's plummeting like a rock, to the point where most Western nations in my lifetime are not going to even be at replacement levels of births.
Mm-hmm.
And
which
you're going to see
roughly 2.1 or 2.3.
Yeah, it's something in those.
Yeah.
Why is that happening? I would argue that is happening as a result of people's convictions about their worldviews falling further and further away from the eternal significance of the human person, which is fundamentally religious. I think ideas, politics, beauty, all of it fundamentally gets eventually to a religious foundation. Mm-hmm. We have limited knowledge of existence. We have a limited knowledge of the world. All of our ideas about morals and values ultimately sometimes rest on intuitions and are fundamentally religious, meaning they fundamentally are not deductive or inductive ideas. They're things that we bring to our experience, not necessarily things that we derive from our experience. And as our society starts to lose more and more of its Christian convictions, we're going to see consequences from that, like falling birth rate, like collapse of marriage as an institution, like the ideas of liberty and freedom that derive from those things falling away.
What can the saint? So, what will there be an American political saint in the course of our lifetimes? Is it going to take a saint to stop our decay or our decline?
Well, there already are some American saints. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, Catherine Drexel, both incredible female saints. They founded entire school systems. Kateri Tekakwitha is a American saint. So there already are American saints, but I also think it's important not to set our hopes on political order. Our happiness is not going to be won or lost. Our eternal salvation, our goodness of our lives is not going to be won or lost depending on whether or not there's the correct or incorrect political order. Those things will affect
That's a really important point. Say more about that, because I think somehow we've been seduced into thinking that the drama on social media is the most important stage, and that there's a political solution to things. And that, the idea of a limited state or the limited role of the public, of the Commonwealth, is being lost. I think day by day.
Yeah, I think one of the things about the saints that I've loved, exploring is that there is a way to live a good life in the middle of any circumstances. And it's also, that's not just a Christian idea too. That's like a Stoic philosophy idea as well, that whether or not you live a good life, a fulfilling life, a human life, is dependent on you, and dependent on, in a Christian worldview, dependent on God's grace and your response to it. You can live a good life in the middle of the concentration camp. It's not necessarily a happy life, but ask Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, right? Like our lives are not good because of an absence of suffering. Our lives are good depending on how we respond to suffering and whether or not we rise to the occasion of our greatest and highest ideals. And in a Christian worldview, that can mean laying your life down for those who need it.
I guess what I'm asking is a different question. Would Jesus use Twitter or X?
I think Jesus would use whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I think as Christians, we're called to use whatever means of communication are in front of us. I think if you read the Gospels, Jesus had relationships with 12 people, with the disciples, and he wasn't trying, it doesn't appear anyways, that he was trying to reach the entire world immediately. He invested in those relationships so that those people could then give that grace to others, right? Like the way that St. Paul never met Jesus, right? But St. Paul was the one.
Well, arguably.
Yeah.
What that trip to Damascus was a little.
That's right. That's right. But I think that's really important to evaluating the Christian faith is, I think we have this idea that like God or faith or whatnot is why would he wait to do anything? Why would he wait to reach America with the gospel? Why would he wait to reach England with the gospel? But that's how Jesus worked in time and history, was working through these relationships with his disciples and apostles. And then they went and worked and, spread the news to other people. So it appears anyway, that God works through human relationships. So whether Jesus would use Twitter or not, he might not, and he might instead want to meet Norm Pattis at a parish in Connecticut and deepen a real relationship and a real human bond there. I think there's a place for mass media. I think there's a place for social media. But for instance, in my line of work, we produce these Saints podcasts. My greatest dream for them is that it makes parents' jobs easier. Because the real magic is not going to be if someone listens to the Joan of Arc podcast and suddenly has a moment of conversion, though God willing that happens. The real magic is going to be if, Sarah with 4 kids in Maine can use these podcasts as a way to evangelize her children, so that when her kids ask her about the faith, her job has been made easier by our work. But ultimately, everything is worked through human relationships. That's what I mean by the political order thing is like, one of the most important things to St. Augustine, it wasn't that society was falling around him in Hippo. It wasn't that, the Roman Empire was starting to disintegrate. It was his relationship with his mom. One of the most moving pieces in the Confessions is one of the last conversations he had with his mother before she died. And it was them talking about what heaven might be like. And that is one of the most moving things to me, because that is what matters in life. It's human relationships. It's fun to talk about political order, and it matters because it affects people's lives and it affects people's relationships. But ultimately, the real thing of lasting value is the things of the heart, which are our relationships.
What sort of feedback have you been getting from the Saints? Have you and what can you share with us? How is it being received?
I can tell you our NPS score. That's how
I don't
geeky
know
I am.
what that is. Yeah.
It's a net promoter score that they use in businesses, and our NPS score is great. So people are very happy with the series and very excited about it. It's interesting. Sometimes I've made the choice that we're doing dialects with the series. So like Joan of Arc has a French accent. You know, she doesn't sound like she's from Wisconsin or Colorado or whatnot. And that's an artistic choice we made to try and make it grounded in reality. But some people want, you know, everyone to have American accents so that it's easier to understand. But other than that, mostly I get responses from parents and from, you know, adults who listen to it without kids, and they're just really deeply moved by the stories. I once floated the idea that we should have a cryometer for the series, which would be a meter that levels how many reports we get of people crying in response to the series. Because there was a week where like we had like 5, 6, 7, whatever number of people tell us that they were just sobbing by the end of the series. And that's, you know, that's just incredible to hear.
And, you know, for those who are joining us late, how do people find it again and tell us more about it?
So they can listen, they can go to thesaintspodcast.com. That's just thesaintspodcast.com. And they'll find it there. They can also just Google, you know, The Saints Podcast or whatever.
And tell us about Relevant Radio again. What is Relevant Radio?
So Relevant Radio is a Catholic talk radio network, 215 stations across the United States in range of 260 million people coast to coast. And they, for a long time, have done excellent work in sort of Catholic talk radio. So like, you know, apologetics, you know, news, things like that. And we were brought on, the Mary Beggars was brought on in 2021 as the entertainment division of Relevant Radio. So we, you know, Relevant Radio's mission is bringing Christ to the world through the media. Media is an expansive term. It includes entertainment. And so we're the entertainment division of that.
So, you know, every time I talk to you, I'm like a man dying of thirst. I take a sip and I feel better, and then I need more and I need more, and I never quite hold the glass. And last time we talked near the end, and I don't know if we're near the end now or not, that's up to you, I suppose. I said, you know, what must we do to be saved? And, you know, I look at you and I see a man inhabited by a vision, and I see a man who talks persuasively about grace, and I see an intellectual confidence that I admire. And I lack all of those qualities. I view myself as a man of unclean lips with feet of clay who struggles through the world, bumping into things, whining every step of the way.
I'm 30. Give me time. Give me time.
Yeah, I got a couple decades on you. I got more than a couple decades on you. You know, you've got the pulpit now. Preach, brother. How do we know?
Well,
How do we come to know God?
So in response to that very generous characterization, I think if any of that is true, I think it comes from my dad. Because when I was growing up, my dad's a theologian. And when I was growing up, he did an unbelievably good job I'm not in any, you know, every respect by any means. You know, everyone as a parent discovers all of their sins. But he did one thing really, really well with our family, which was truth was the capital value. Like everything came down to whether or not it was true. It was never whether it was advantageous. It was never whether or not it was useful or pleasurable or profitable. It was always, it always came back to whether or not something is true. And I think that has been just such a beautiful gift from my parents, because as children, that's sort of our natural state. to seek what is true. Why does it rain? Do you love me, Dad? What is 14 times whatever? Like, our natural orientation is towards truth, and it's so easy to, especially as you get older, it's so easy to let that innocence, that original innocence, get covered by the cares and the worries of the world. And I think the beauty of the faith is that it gives us a pathway back to that original innocence. Like, it gives us a pathway back to, and that's been my experience in life, is like going to confession, returning to my faith again and again and again, is a constant renewal of that experience of original innocence. Because everyone falls, everyone sins, everyone is tempted to all sorts of things. And the
That
beauty,
which I would do, I don't. That's what I get it. Yes, I do, Mr. St. Paul.
well, and there's a great phrase in the Gospels that I only really became aware of in college, which is, when the disciples were with Jesus, there's this phrase that's repeated in the Bible again and again, which is, and they believed, and they believed, and they believed, and they believed, which seems to imply that the process of belief or trust is a process. It's not a moment or just one event. It's a process, like any relationship. And I think for me in my life, and I think for most people's lives, that process of trust in God is basically a process of encountering something in my life, trying to manage it myself because I'm afraid that if I don't, my life will fall to hell. Usually being dominated by fear, and then being invited back to trust that I have a God who is my Father, who will take care of me, and taking that step in faith. And that experience of returning again and again to, like, I have student debt from Columbia University. It sucks. There is part of me that is just like, forget the saints, forget relevant radio. I'm just going to like go be a stock trader or something so I can make a ton of money and just get rid of the student debt and buy, like, but that is totally driven by fear. That narrative of like doing whatever it takes to earn the most amount of money so that I can finally be secure is something driven 100% by fear. And as a Christian, as a Catholic, I have to discern, like, where is God calling me in life? Because if I discern then I can trust that God will take care of me. And that might look like, losing everything and being, taken in by family and friends, but there's a pathway that is my relationship to God. The good example of this is my dad used to be an Anglican priest. He was an Anglican priest in a little island in Canada called Graminan Island. My mom didn't work. She was the pastor's wife. And they had 5 children. And my dad and my mom became,
including that reprobate lawyer Will.
Including that reprobate lawyer. He was a reprobate lawyer even back then. It was terrible. He was, I don't know, 11 and just throwing law at us. It was an unpleasant experience. I didn't exist yet, but my mom, and which is a tragedy. My mom,
and the world groaned in anticipation of your birth. Oh, unto us a child is born. Yeah, yeah.
My dad and my mom both discerned that the Catholic Church was the true faith, and they became more and more disillusioned with the state of Anglicanism at that time, and they felt called to leave the Anglican Church and join the Catholic Church. And that meant that it's still sort of like emotional for me to think about, because now that I have a child, it's like the consequences of that decision, come home in a new way. But that meant that they would have 5 children with no income, and they would be alienated from the community that they had spent years building up. And they had the conviction to do that. And that has led to that. I mean, if you're thinking about that as a parent, like, that is such a stepping off of the cliff into the unknown, which is like, as a human being, that's like the thing that we're trying to avoid, right? Like,
Yeah, no, I got it.
And that is what God was calling them to in that moment. So when you ask the question is, what must I do to be saved? I can't answer that because I don't know what other people's lives are. But if you look into your heart and you look into your life, not you in particular, but everyone, and
Yeah, I
are
don't have a heart.
open
I'm
to
a criminal
God.
defense lawyer. You forget that. Yeah.
What's that?
I don't have a heart. I'm a criminal defense lawyer.
That's
You
right. That's
forget
right.
yourself. Yeah.
Well, then borrow someone else's heart,
Yeah.
and you look into it. Then you have to discern where's God's voice. Where's God's voice calling you? I could give some trite phrase, and there are like, yeah, you should join the Catholic Church. You should go to confession. All these different things, which is like, yeah, sure. But in terms of people's actual lives, I don't know what that looks like. It might be, going to a Catholic church and listening to the homily, and not going up to receive, but just being there and seeing what happens. Or it might be starting off the morning and borrow a prayer from a good 12-step program. I like the third step prayer is great. God, offer myself to thee to build with me and do with thee as I will. That I don't know it all, but that I might be basically free of all my selfishness and do thy will and show your love to other people, right? Or you could just start out with the St. Francis prayer or whatever. I don't know, because it's a temptation with any institution to depersonalize it. And that applies to religions. It's a temptation to templatize, your relationship to God and just be like, hey, got the catechism here. I don't need to talk to you. I don't care about you, but here's the book. Go read it, submit, repent, and submit to the Pope, which was my answer last time. But that's not reality, and that's not how God encounters individuals. And the beauty of the faith, the beauty of any faith that is honest and discerning a path towards God, is that it is dealing with the deepest parts of the human heart. And that is so unique, so individual, that it needs to be each person's response to God. And the only other thing I would say is that it's not individualistic. There's a temptation in American society to be extremely individualistic, meaning that my relationship to God is only in my own heart. It's a private thing. It shouldn't be brought to anyone else. But that's never happened ever with any faith and any person ever. St. Augustine was converted because his mom. He talks about trying other philosophies and pagan beliefs, but nothing that did not, I can't quote it exactly, but he said, nothing that did not have the name of Christ with which I was suckled with at my mother's breast could satisfy me. So it was
Not
really,
everybody gets a Monica, though.
yes, not everyone gets a Saint Monica, but we all get a Saint Augustine who tells us about Saint Monica. So
do you have time for one more topic?
Go for it.
We've kept you for an hour. AI, complexity, super intelligence. Will there ever? Let's assume that there are so many neurons in the human brain, and let's assume for the moment that we can harness enough electricity in enough machines to have exactly that number of neurons in a neural network. Does the thing become human at that point? Does it acquire a longing for God? Is it capable of that? Or is there something that ineffable once the mind has been mapped? Well, not the mind. Once the brain has been mapped and the switch has been flicked, is the machine going to experience longing?
Yeah, it's interesting.
There's Neil Stephenson's got I can't remember the name of the book. It's about 1,000 pages long. I think it's oh, doggone it, The Fall or something like that. And the premise of the book is some fabulously wealthy tech guy in Seattle gets his brain sliced up, and it's kept, and finally somebody acquires enough power to re-energize the thing. And now this brain becomes a mind, and it's the unfolding of that mind in time, which occupies the 1,100 pages or so of Stevenson's book. And I have my doubts. I mean, to me, one of the most convincing things about the Catholic theology is the account of human origins. I call it, I'm no Blaise Pascal, but I call it Pattis's wager. You're going to wager on what to believe in
It's
life.
Blaise's Pascal's wager, but with an edge.
Yeah, that's true. We're either avatars from a universe we don't understand in a computer game that people are playing, because in infinity, if you can imagine something, it's possible, and not just possible, but probably, and not just probable, but it's occurred, because there is so much time and space out there. So somebody's actually having this discussion like us, and they are us in another universe, and it's possible that we're avatars in a computer game being played by bored teenagers in Mike's hometown. It's possible. But to me, it seems more likely that we were created in the image of God, and find ourselves in his world. And that seems like a far more satisfying account of being than any that I've encountered elsewhere. But AI poses a challenge. What if that wonderfully complex machine gets up and says, I have no longing?
Well, okay, so I have a couple thoughts. One is, nothing that we're seeing right now with generative AI moves towards anything like what you're talking about.
True. I know.
So the thing with generative AI, which is ChatGPT, Claude, Anthropic, Bard, Gemini, all the different large language models, all of them are I think I'm correct in saying this. They're statistical productions of original word combinations. So they have, I think, like 3 billion parameters on their algorithm. And so they're bringing in just completely new levels of complexity, and they're statistically extremely advanced. But we don't, like, even the creators of them don't really know why they produce the results they do. And I've spent a lot of time with them developing different, versions of them, and playing around with them. And I use AI probably about a dozen times a day to work on things and whatnot. So I'm a big fan of AI. I'm a big proponent of it. I think it basically is going to be an intelligence amplifier. So people who are already smart will be able to use it to advance their productivity and develop things and so on and so forth. But it is, where I've come down in terms of generative AI, which is different than exactly what you asked, but I've found that it tricks you into thinking that it's intelligent because it is producing words, which are the thing by which we express ideas. So I'm able to recognize an intelligent idea, saying, the catechism or elsewhere, by reading and interpreting the words, which are not themselves intelligence, but they're the output of intelligent thought. And what I've found is that working with generative AI, it can produce words and combinations of words which look like the production of intelligent thought, but on a conceptual level, it can't deal in logical principles. Like, it doesn't operate at a conceptually deep level. It operates in using, trillions of pieces of data of other people who did operate on a conceptual level, like a logical, immaterial level. It can work with the output, the words of all of those people, and create something new that looks identical to intelligent output, but is really just output statistically generated from other output. Now that's super useful, but like it means that there's something different happening in generative AI than in an intelligence creating something. And so, for instance, a good example of this is, like, if you play with an LLM long enough, you can get it to agree that 2 + 2 = 5. Now, I know that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. And it's not just because we work on, like, our current number system based on 10 or whatever. Like, the logic of 2 existing things added to 2 other existing things is these 4 existing things, whether or not I use the word 2 or 4 or whatever. And that's an immaterial, logical conceptualization of that thing. AI, at least generative AI, doesn't do that. I don't know if that applies to unbelievably complex mapping of neurons, but I sort of suspect that it does. And that ability to access and interact with logic is because as a human being, I have an immaterial intellect. So my brain, I can direct the shaping of my neuron pathways because of neuroplasticity. I can actually shape and direct them through an immaterial intellect. So if you look at the brain, you can identify, what images or what pathways correspond to what thoughts. There's AI experiments where they're able to like generate images based off of, patterns in people's brains. And the divergent view is either you think that the brain pathways lighting up those things are those images, are those memories, are those thoughts, or you think that there's an immaterial intellect that is affecting and using the brain as an organ to generate those images and thoughts and experiences and whatnot. And I would adopt the immaterial intellect view.
Well, we don't know about that ghost in the machine, but we're finding out more every year.
I think it's interesting. I think AI is going to either make people think that human beings are chemically interesting meat bags, or they're going to make us realize what is unique about human beings, because it is the difference between the machine and a human.
When I see a machine commit suicide because it can't understand the purpose of it all, I'll be persuaded that
That's
it's
a blue screen of death. That's all. That's Windows machines from the early 2000s.
Well, there is that.
Harry carrying themselves.
So, Pete, thank you very much for joining us today. We've taken a lot of your time, and you're always so gracious in sharing time with us. Mike, thank you for asking so many questions and moving this along. Folks, thanks for listening.
Next time we need to find some time where just you and I, Norm, can talk, because Mike was butting in here all the time.
I know. I mean, it kept, I had a train of thought, but he kept derailing it. So listen, thanks for joining us on Law and Legitimacy, folks. You can find us Monday through Friday, wherever you can find fine podcasts. We're doing long form interviews with folks that we find extraordinarily interesting, and trying to get behind the headlines and behind the news, and talk about people whose lives matter in ways that can transform not just your lives, but ours and everyone else's. And Pete's one of those guys. Take a look at the Merry Beggars. Ask yourself, of these saints, they inhabit the same world that you do, and they are responding to things that are presumably present in your world. Are you missing out on things? Are you missing out on larger drama, a larger sense of significance, which we talk about all the time, by not heeding the voices or not heeding the experiences that perhaps are available to you? Not everybody can become a saint, but everyone can become saved. And that's the promise of the gospel. Those of us who believe it take great solace in it, even as we struggle with its application in our lives. So thanks for listening to Law and Legitimacy. Mike, you got anything you want to say anything today, or you just gonna kind of look handsome,
Yeah, well, at least I get a compliment out of that.
Yeah.
It's nice to be a student, and I feel in these moments, Norm, Pete, as though my role here is to learn. You said one thing, Pete, before we really got started, asking about, the naming of children, and I was preoccupied for several minutes, even when the two of you have moved past the topic, in wondering about my decision to name my son and make him a junior. And I felt as though I saw myself for the first time in a unique way. And it was almost it was very selfish, but it was aspirational in that I'm asking my son to want more of me, right? To want better of me. And there's only one way to go about that, and it is a moral centered way. And so I'll be thinking more about that. And I'm sure that, Norm, there will be at least an essay or two that comes from the substance of this interview. So I think I really just want to say thank you, Pete, and thank you guys for letting me just shut up and not talk. I spent a lot of my week just jibber jabbering, especially every morning at 8 a.m. Monday through Friday at Law Pod Daily. But this is a really moving conversation for me, and I think, Pete, I was baptized Catholic as a baby, and I've spent exactly 0 time during my life in the Catholic Church, and that's not an insignificant fact to me. So I'll be talking with you more offline. So thank you.
Well, yeah, and I think as we get older, it's easier to see clearer the things that matter. as we get older. And so, you know, I don't get to talk.
Oh, it is it? Thanks, pal.
Yeah, right.
I'm perpetually young.
Well, okay, physically you might need glasses, but spiritually, and I don't get to talk about this stuff during the week most of the time because I'm busy, you know, trying to hire actors and whatnot. So it's always a joy to be on with you guys.
Thanks for joining us. All right, folks, we'll talk to you soon. Be well, everyone. Ciao.
Yeah, lawpoddaily.com. Join the newsletter, lawpoddaily.com. Pete, thank you. You can find Pete at the Saints Podcast, thesaintspodcast.com, the Merry Beggars, Relevant Radio. However you want people to find you beyond that, Pete, you can tell them yourself, but the saintspodcast.com. Thank you, guys.
Ciao.